You're listening to The Big Album Show with Paul Dillon and Dan O'Neill.
Hello and welcome to the latest edition of The Big Album Show with me, Paul.
And me, Dan.
Back to Black by Amy Winehouse was a musical release which came in one sense from the old musical world. By this, I mean it was released when the CD was still king and the music press and the mainstream media were still the dominant ways by which you would get your information about music. When the album was released back in October 2006, Facebook was only open for business by a matter of weeks. Twitter would soon follow, and everything was about to change. So Amy was one of the last artists of the old school, signed by a major label, who released music in what you might now call the traditional way. Back to Black went on to sell in massive numbers. Think about this: 16 million copies worldwide, 3.5 million copies in the UK alone. One of the biggest selling albums of the 21st century so far. And it's not hard to understand why. It's emotional, it's intense, it's funny. It's a bit like Dan O'Neill in that sense. And Dan, what amazes me about this album, and I'm front loading my hot take here, is the fusion of sound, the mix of jazz, hip hop, this incredibly unique voice. And we just can't really categorize Amy as belonging to any particular scene, but she's a scene all to herself. And that's something that can be said for just a handful of artists.
A musician that changed the face of music at that particular time. Because when you think about kind of the pop scene, I suppose, and when Amy came out with this album, it was very different. And I think Amy paved the way for the likes of Adele, the likes of Duffy, with this album. If you could compare this album to Frank, which is Amy's first album, there's definitely a change between the two albums. You know, we see Amy Winehouse develop into the kind of Amy Winehouse that's remembered in popular culture. But throughout both albums, you hear her fantastic, strong kind of contralto voice, which is kind of a deep, soulful voice. And you know, Amy was always musical. So back in the day, before she was famous as a teenager, she was involved in the National Jazz Orchestra in the UK. On her mother's side, she had uncles who were jazz musicians. On her father's side, I believe her grandmother was a jazz singer. So she had all of these influences going into her head, and she was listening to great jazz voices while other people were listening to, you know, E17 and the Spice Girls. But at the same time, as you mentioned in the introduction, Amy had a love for the likes of hip hop artists such as Nas, and then in her choice of producers and so on, she picked people connected with the hip hop world. And then in her lyrics, you can hear kind of hip hop lyrics come true in her music. So there's so much to say about Amy Winehouse.
Yeah, and you know, then people who listen to the Big Album Show know that we have complementary skills. You're the guy who can talk about music and play music, whereas I can only really do one of those things. Though of course I can play air guitar quite well and quite often. But I think we should delve a bit into the music here. I mean, you touched on some of it there. Frank, the first record, and I'll be frank, right? I'll just put it out there. I love Frank. It's a beautiful record in its own right. It's now almost forgotten because Back to Black is so big that it just kind of, I mean, it defines Amy really as an artist. But I mean, Frank is great. And you know, it's a lovely listen. It's an easy listen, Frank, let's be honest. And there's such lovely performances by it. Oftentimes, you know, some of the promos that she did was just her and her guitar.
Oh, yeah.
But musically, what seemed to happen was that something changed, and things changed in her life. And of course, the personal is so much to the fore in Amy Winehouse. You're talking about an artist who bears her soul, really. But she pivoted, to borrow that kind of corporate term, massively. Somewhere between Frank and Back to Black, something changed. Now, my take comes from that interview she did with John Kelly and other voices around 4 weeks, I think, before Back to Black was released, where she talks about getting into soul music in the last year or two before this album was released. But what do you hear going on here? Because You've got the jazz, you've got the hip hop, you've got the soul, and you've got this fusion, really, don't you, Dan? I mean, that makes it this very unique Amy Winehouse sound.
Yeah, definitely. Her sound is completely unique because, first of all, every note that Amy Winehouse sings sounds like it's personal, and she's an artist that isn't afraid to kind of show her vulnerability. She, in her voice and in her lyrics, when you listen, what you get is almost a stream of consciousness, you know. You get an insight right into the mind of Amy Winehouse. She has an incredible eye for detail in her music and in her lyrics. And one of the things, just as an example of her eye for detail, is when she was finished recording her songs, she used to sit in the back of her dad's taxi and listen to the music, because she realized that's how most people would actually hear the songs.
Yeah.
So rather than listen to the music in kind of fancy studio headphones, she would sit in the back of the taxi and actually listen to the music. And what I hear going on here is, I think you're completely right in that she started listening to more kind of soul music. In fact, she kind of wanted to break from the kind of jazz style of Frank, and she said that in the run up to this album, she listened to many girl bands from the 1960s. So you're talking about people like the Shangri-Las, the Vandellas, you know, a lot of kind of Motown music, of course, and music that might have been produced by Phil Spector, like the Ronettes and those kind of bands. And that seems to be what she was listening to. And the interesting thing about this album is although it's not hip hop, we keep mentioning there's hip hop elements. And one of the hip hop elements to the album isn't just the lyrics. When you listen to the kind of instrumentation and the melody within the various songs on the album, it's almost like Amy Winehouse and the two producers have sampled music, as you would in hip hop, from other artists. And I have some examples that I might point to, but you can literally hear other songs in the music as if they were sampled, although they were played by musicians afresh, you know. But you hear so much going on.
Yeah, and no doubt about that, Alan. Just when you were speaking there, it just reminded me of some of my own just favorite Amy Winehouse tunes. And my two personal favorites aren't actually on this record, but they're both covers. Our Day Will Come, which is you know, just sung so beautifully by Amy, but also the old classic, Will You Still Love Me Tomorrow, which she covered just so beautifully and so effectively. But you know, let's have a look at some of the tunes on the album, because you know she's I mean, of course, Marvin Gaye, our old friend. Listen back to our pod on What's Going On. We delved pretty deeply into Marvin Gaye. She went there, didn't she, Dan? In a big way. She you know, and Mark Ronson, of course, the producer, big influence. They drew on a whole back catalog to make something that was completely new and unique. And in there seems to be a touch of genius, really, to take sounds that are totally recognizable, that you know, and say, oh, where did I hear that before? But yet make a record that sounds like nothing else.
Yeah, definitely. Like, just to talk about, I think Amy Winehouse is the major talent on this album, obviously.
Yes, definitely, unquestionably.
But you can't talk about the album without mentioning the two people who were involved in producing it also, and writing parts of it with Amy. So you had one guy, Salim Remy, who was also involved in an album we did in a previous episode, The Score by the Fugees.
Yes.
Worked with Estelle, Fergie, and he was one of the big songs on The Score he produced was Fuji La, like, and he worked with Nas as well, who's another hip hop artist that Amy Winehouse was really into. So there's the hip hop kind of DNA. But then Mark Ronson, really interesting character. Of course, he's become massive in the pop world. Like, Mark Ronson is now a giant in his own right, whereas
he's so big he might even come on the Big Album Show himself. He's that big.
We'll put a call out.
Go on.
But he's a really interesting character. Like, when he was a kid himself, he was from a musical background. He was friends with John Lennon's son, Sean Lennon, and all this kind of interesting things. But apart from the interesting backstory, uh, his primary contribution to the album, in his words, was that he kept Amy out of the pub. But I think he was being unfair to himself. I think his real contribution was, as well as writing songs with Amy and befriending Amy and creating a space where both of them could work together in a really good, healthy, creative way. Another thing he did was he moved the recording of the album to a place called Daptown Studios, or Daptone Studios, I should say, in Brooklyn. And it's an analog studio. So rather than all of the machinery being digital, it was recorded as songs would have been recorded for the Marvin Gaye albums, the Motown albums, all of those things. And the local house band who were resident in the studio were called the Dap Kings, and they played on the album. So you get this really genuine sound. And the way it's produced, like if you listen to some of Amy's vocals on the album, on old recordings, right, when I'm not going to get too technical about this because I'm not going to bore people to death, but when people kind of sung into mics, it would kind of clip into the red, and you'd kind of hear it distort when they sung very loud. On a lot of the tracks, the producers allowed that to happen with Amy's vocals. So you hear this kind of gentle kind of distortion, overdrive on some of the loud points of Amy's singing. And so it gives it this really, really authentic kind of old sound. But at the same time, Amy is such an incredible, or was such an incredible songwriter, that she was able to kind of use this the colors of the past in terms of the music and the style, but then make it so contemporary. That's one of the reasons I love Amy Winehouse, is because she didn't just do what other singers do, like, which is completely copy sounds of the past. She took the past, it flavored what she did, but she was able to take it and make it so contemporary. It was incredible.
Yeah, and I think she did that so well. If you listen to a track, which is, to be honest, my favorite track on the album, is Tears Dry on Their Own. It sounds very familiar when you listen to it, and of course it is very familiar because it's that melody of Ain't No Mountain High Enough. There's a load of different versions of the track out there, but the version that's on Back to Black is, for me, nothing comes near it. Terrific lyrics. I mean, it's quite somber and really super video as well to accompany it. So it definitely is my top track. In terms of, I don't know, Dan, do you have a top track or top three tracks?
Yeah, I that's one of my top tracks as well. I love it. And that thing you mentioned of the kind of melody, the opening bass line and structure of the song, it's copied from Ain't No Mountain High Enough by Marvin Gaye and Tammy Terrell. You call that, here's the word of the day for people, every day is a school day. It's called interpolation. I only learned it myself today. So whereas sampling in hip hop is where you take an actual recording of something and put it into your song, interpolation is where you take the melody and the sound, and even if you played it, I challenge listeners to play the two songs back to back, and you'll hear how incredibly similar they are, because basically they took the sample and then just played the sample from scratch in the studio. So it's almost exactly the same. And it once you realize that, as you pointed out, like, you hear the song in a different way, but the lyrics of that song are really incredible, as are the lyrics on all of the songs. So
and as are the videos for the singles as well, Dan. And I mean, you're talking about Amy here, this extraordinary singer, extraordinary songwriter, but also an extraordinary performer, I think, And I mean, she could really, she could hold a stage, she could, and in those videos, she can act really, really well. I mean, that's that, she's got that skill, she's got that ability, and that genius. I'm no good would get my number two. It starts with this terrific drum track, and then Amy just brings you right into the world. So it's very situational when she sings "Meet You Downstairs in the Bar and Heard You Rolled Up Sleeves in Your Skull T-shirt," and very, very strong image that comes into you, brings you into her world, and just a really, really good track, which is both upbeat and I wouldn't say positive, but there's so much going on that, you know, depending on your mood. And one of the takes that I have about this album is the more you listen to this, the better it gets and the more you see going on. So it's a track like I'm No Good. There's a ton of cover versions out there. And then, of course, there is the original. Now, it was a single. It charted at number 37 in the UK charts. So 36 other songs sold more. But there you go. That was 2007 when people were buying CD singles in their tens of thousands. I'm going to go with Back to Black as my, you know, it's difficult. You know, we try and do top three here, but it's hard to say, you know, these are my top three, but I've had difficulty saying which is one and which is two and three, which is three. I mean, Back to Black is just another terrific track. I mean, what a video. I mean, along with, you know, it is one of the defining Amy tracks. Everyone knows it still gets huge radio play to this day. And the video, again, it's a funeral, which is, you know, there's a darkness to it, but you see this extraordinary performance by Amy in it, and you know, that one was, you know, co-written and co-produced with Mark Ronson, and it just, you know, just a terrific track, Back to Black, Dan. I mean, the title track from the album, the defining track maybe of the album, and again, an artist here bearing her soul for listeners, really.
Yeah, absolutely. It's incredible, Paul, because tonight is one of those nights where we've picked the exact same three songs as our top three. Just to take you back to the first one you mentioned again, I was going to say the lyrics, because it goes back to something I was going to say earlier on, is that you get a great example of the kind of stream of consciousness that you get on this album, where you get to see into Amy Winehouse's mind. So, you know, ultimately, it's a heartbreak song, Tears Dry on Her Own. And then you have the kind of, the song ends with this kind of stream of consciousness narrative of Amy Winehouse wrestling with herself. So the lyrics go, even if I stopped wanting you, a perspective pushes me through. I'll be some next man's other woman soon. I cannot play myself again. I should just be my own best friend, not fuck myself in the head with stupid men. And you can see her kind of wrestling with herself. It's incredibly open, powerful. You know, it's just all there. And then the next song you mentioned, You Know I'm No Good, and another great example of an Amy Winehouse track, because you can definitely see the hip hop influence here. If you listen to the kind of hip hop beat, it reminds me of Jump Around by House of Pain almost, but then the song is completely different from that track, obviously, and the lyrics then in that song are almost cinematic. You know, you have those lyrics you mentioned, where it opens with a kind of a scene meeting someone downstairs in a bar, and then that person, the lover, sniffing her out like Tanqueray, you know. And then there's even she alludes to a movie in the lyrics. It's so cinematic. She talks about you tear men down like Roger Moore, you know, a James Bond reference. And funny enough, Roger Moore laughed when he heard his name being referenced in the song. He said that he didn't know why she picked him as the reference, but it might have been because she couldn't rhyme anything with Connery, which might have been the case. And then Back to Black then is definitely the kind of defining Amy Winehouse song. And there is, again, it kind of borrows, it's highly influenced by a track by the Shangri-Las called Remember Walking in the Sand. Now, the songs are very different, but if you listen to that song side by side with Back to Black, you can hear similarities. And writing in Mojo in June 2010, Mark Ronson gave an account of how they came up with the song. And you might indulge me and I just read that for a minute, Paul, because I think it gives a real insight into how the album was actually written, recorded, etc. So Mark Ronson said this. He said, "I'll never forget the first day I met Amy, because it changed everything. It was in New York, March 2006, in the studio I used to have on Mercer Street. She told me she presumed I was some old guy with a beard like Rick Rubin. I just thought, let's talk about music, see what she likes. She said she liked to go out to bars and clubs and play snooker with her boyfriend and listen to the Shangri-Las. She played me some of those records, which turned into a crash course in girl group productions. She was staying at the Soho Grand around the corner, and I told her that I had nothing to play her right now, but if she let me work on something overnight, she could come back tomorrow. So I came up with this little piano riff, which became the verse chords to Back to Black. Behind it, I just put a kick drum and a tambourine and tons of reverb even. She came back the next day and she was really into it. Ended up staying for 2 weeks and we fleshed out 5 or 6 songs. It started with her and her nylon string guitar, and she would play me the song and I would write the chords down. Then she would leave for the night and I would go nuts with the arrangements. And I think that just is a good indication of the kind of relationship Mark Ronson and Amy Winehouse developed during the writing of this album. Like Rehab is another good example of that relationship. They were walking down the road and apparently in jest, Amy Winehouse came out with the lines, they told me I should go to rehab. And I said, no, no, no. And all of a sudden the light bulb went on and they both went off and worked on it together. And I think Amy Winehouse is incredible, but there's something magic about this album, the way all of the forces came together to produce one of the greatest albums, as you say, of recent years. I think there's something magic about it.
Definitely, and you can imagine the kind of the process and the relationship that produces a record like this. And there's something almost magical about it. And one of the things that is magical definitely is the live performance that Amy did a number of weeks prior to the release of Back to Black in Dingle in County Kerry, where she did the Other Voices thing, and she did this terrific interview with John Kelly. There's a documentary about it. You'll get it on YouTube. But she did a bunch of songs, Dan, from the album, 20 minutes, and she's paired back herself. There's 2 guitarists. There's no drummer. The drummer got delayed, bad weather, couldn't make the gig. And it's Back to Black, stripped back, right? And you just hear the songs at their most raw, their most basic almost, but also, I think in my book, the most effective. And that gig, 22 minutes long in St. James's Church in Dingle, part of the Other Voices series, it's just terrific. And it's for some people have gone as far as say it's the greatest gig that they've ever seen, but of course they didn't see it. They'd only hear a recording of it. There's a very small number of people in the church. I think the Times rated it as the 17th greatest gig of all time. But what that gig showcases is the kind of versatility of the music, that it can be played in different ways, in different settings, and it's just an extraordinary show, and the emotion is to the fore. And once you hear it, you kind of go, I want to listen to that again. And the fact that it's only 22 minutes leaves you wanting more.
Yeah, I agree with you completely. And like Amy Winehouse, although I've been ranting about the production and so on a lot in this podcast, you're right. When you strip back Amy Winehouse and you hear her just with 1 or 2 musicians, or indeed her guitar on her own, she really shines. And again, I know it's not off this album, but there's a great video on YouTube of her with her Fender Stratocaster, just her playing the song Stronger Than Me. And it you just watch Amy Winehouse perform that song in such a stripped back way, and everything is there, everything is there. And sometimes when people talk about Amy Winehouse, they talk about all the stuff that went with the image at the time. But I know you agree with me here, Paul. This show isn't about that. This show is about the music. And there's plenty to speak about in terms of Amy Winehouse's music, because she's one of the greats. I have no qualms about saying that. Amy Winehouse is one of the greats, and it's sad that she's not around to produce more albums. But before I depress everyone, I also have to say this: the Big Album Show wouldn't be the Big Album Show without a reference to Bono at some point during the.
We gotta go there. We gotta go there. It's part of what defines us.
yeah, definitely. So we've talked in the past about Bono's critics. And Amy Winehouse was one of Bono's critics at one stage. So at the 2006 Q Awards, Bono won an award with the band, and he got up to make a speech, and he was thanking plenty of people, I'm sure. And the Bell Amy piped up and said, "Shut up, Bono. I don't want to. I've heard enough, you know." So I don't know. She seemed to be a bit of a critic, but lovely of Bono, because in 2011, I believe, he just after Amy's sad departure, Bono was playing a gig in Minneapolis, and he dedicated a version of "Stuck in a Moment" to the memory of Amy Winehouse. So that's the Bono story for tonight.
And she's she's a kind of, you might want to say, an artist or musician, because people like Lady Gaga, Adele, so many other people have paid such incredible tributes to Amy. Lady Gaga said in 2011 that Amy changed pop music forever. I remember knowing there was hope and feeling not alone because of her. Adele, of course, thanked Amy Winehouse for paving the way, and made people excited about music, being fearlessly hilarious and blasé about the whole thing. So Beyonce, of course, and then all those cover versions that are out there of not just Back to Black, but the entire Amy back catalogue. So, and of course, just what you're really talking about here in Back to Black, Dan, as you referenced, the music is. This is an album, and this is the take that I'm going to leave you and the listeners with. It comes before music changed forever. So it comes before YouTube, Spotify, before everything changes. I was going to say before everything was wrecked, but I don't mean it like that. I mean when it was, when music was consumed in the record that had a beginning, a middle, and an end. And Back to Black makes sense. It's almost cinematic. It's almost film-like in that it has a very, very. The track listing is superb. The artistry of the album is superb. The use of imagery, the use of black is brilliant. And one of my hot takes is to listen to this album well and effectively. It's not necessarily for. It's not a headphone type album. You got to use it to fill the room, to fill the sound around you, and let it consume you, and it'll get better and better.
I think there's no better way to finish the podcast than that. I think it's a lovely sentiment. I think this is an album for listening to, and in a way, to dedicate time to listening to it, because it's certainly worthy of that in the way you've described. Tell me this, Paul. Have we had any comments on the old social about this album?
Yes, indeed we have. And thank you to the people. Lots of love coming in for Back to Black. A very nice one came in from Keith on Twitter. He says, "Supreme songwriting on display throughout. Genuinely classic 60s, but fresh production. Her voice is stunning and the stylings are both familiar and new. The songs are just sublime. Rehab, Love is a Losing Game. The whole album is a stone cold tragic classic." And I think that's a very, very, very good tribute from Keith, and thanks for that, and thanks to the other people who got in touch with your tributes to Amy. Much appreciated.
Yeah, and just thanks in general to people for listening to the podcast. We've gotten incredible support, and a particular thanks to our loyal fans, if you can call them fans at this stage, who engage with us regularly on social media. We really, really appreciate that. And also to the guests that we've had on so far, Paul Page and Rick McMurray. That meant the world to us. And we're delighted to say that we have Jake Riley from the band The Blades on our next episode. So if you like the podcast, the main thing we're going to ask you to do is subscribe to the podcast and leave us a very short review or a rating, because this is an independent podcast. Everyone knows that the podcast market, for want of a better phrase, is being filled with big companies, and that's fine. There's nothing wrong with that necessarily, but I think it's really important that there's a space for independent podcasts out there. So if you want to support our podcast and independent podcasts in general, the way to do that is by listening, subscribing, and leaving short reviews, because it helps us stay within the space in the podcast world. So please do that.
Definitely. And thank you again for listening to this edition of the Big Album Show, and talk to you soon. You're listening to the Big Album Show with Paul and Dan. Please remember to subscribe, hit like, and remember to follow us on our social media platforms at The Big Album Show.